Good morning, neighborhood church. As you can see, when you are the second string teacher, they make you bring your own table out. And now that I'm winded, let's talk. Neighborhood, my name's Jordan. If we haven't met yet, I'm part of the team here, and today we are continuing our series, 4 Relationship Killers. This month, we are exploring 4 toxic habits that harm our relationships with our spouses, our friends, our kids, all our relationships. And here's what these 4 relationship killers look like. They are criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. We're doing this series because in Neighborhood, we think relationships are really, really important. Social science has shown us time and time again that healthy relationships and community are absolutely necessary to living a fulfilling life. Not only that, but relationships are the foundation of God's kingdom. The author Pete Scazzero once claimed that loving well is the goal of the Christian life. When we decide to follow Jesus, he transforms us through relationships. Vertically, in our relationship with God, horizontally in our relationships with each other and community, and even inwardly in our relationship with ourselves. Jesus didn't come to build temples, cathedrals, or multi-million-dollar church campuses. He came to kickstart a radical community of transcendent relationships defined by love. But the thing is, our world is filled with broken relationships, isn't it? In fact, so much of the pain and suffering in this world is a direct result of relational breakdown. People like to blame the media, the internet, Facebook, Instagram, pop culture, maybe violent video games, all these different things people blame as the root of society's issues. But I think that broken relationships are the bedrock of suffering. Take homelessness, for example. Did you know that in California, there are over 151,000 people currently living on the streets? 151,000 people experiencing homelessness. That's almost as much as the entire population of Visalia. And I found that so many times people are quick to diagnose the issue. Oh, it's drugs. Oh, it's mental illness. Oh, it's, society's going down the tubes. Oh, society's pulling away from God, and so things are going haywire. We're so quick to diagnose the issue. I used to work at a large homeless shelter in Seattle, Washington. And yes, we saw all those issues in the homeless population. But we also saw that those issues were just the symptoms of a greater disease. We saw that those issues were the fruit of the matter, not the root. So the question is, what is the root issue in something like homelessness? As you may know, we partner up with an organization called Salt and Light. They're actually born out of this community at Neighborhood Church, and they're doing an amazing job loving our homeless neighbors in Tulare County. And here's how they answer that question. We know from our work that the greatest cause of homelessness is a profound, catastrophic loss of family. Broken relationships are the issues in which all other issues stack on top of. Broken relationships are the bedrock of suffering. What leads to mental illness, drug abuse, and so much other suffering out there in the homeless community? It's the traumatic loss of relationships and love. So what's the solution? Here's what they say at Salt and Light. When the family fails, we believe community steps in. What's the cure to broken relationships? Community. Friendship, love, acceptance. And this is why these community partners of ours are actually building a neighborhood, a village where people struggling with homelessness can come, have dignified jobs, have housing, experience community and relationships with each other. It's something we definitely think you should check out and get involved with. The point is, community is the solution. Relationships are the solution to our brokenness. When I worked at Seattle's Union Gospel Mission, one of my coworkers was named Mike. And he worked in the men's shelter downtown in Pioneer Square for years and years. He'd seen people come and go. He'd heard every terrible story you could ever imagine. And this is what he always said to me. He said, Jordan, relationship is the catalyst for growth. Relationship is where healing begins, not just for those suffering with homelessness, but for everyone. And the way of Jesus is expressed primarily through the building, the maintenance, and enjoyment of healthy relationships. That's how our lives and our world are transformed. Thriving relationships with God, with each other, and with ourselves. That's what the kingdom of God looks like. Not buildings and programs, but people and communities. So we think relationships are really important. And last week we started off this series by talking about the relationship killer of criticism. We talked about how we live in a very critical culture, and often that criticism leaks into our relationships and poisons them. This week, we're moving on to our next relationship killer, which is defensiveness. Defensiveness is a relationship killer. Here's how relational expert and psychologist John Gottman defines defensiveness: as self-protection in the form of righteous indignation or innocent victimhood in the attempt to ward off a perceived attack. How many of you in the room today would be willing to admit that it's easy for you to get defensive sometimes? I've got both hands way up in the air. Drama king right here, y'all. It's easy to get defensive when we feel like people are attacking our character. But the problem is our ego gets the best of us and we start to interpret everything as an attack. Someone tries to help us out, give us a heads up, or maybe hold us accountable, and we hit back with the, "Why are you literally attacking me right now?" Right? Defensiveness is dramatic. And here's what it can look like in our day-to-day lives. Our boss asks us why we dropped the ball on a project, and we begin to blame our coworkers. Our spouse asks us to clean up our mess at home, and we start copying an attitude. Our kids ask us why we keep breaking our promises to them, and we make lame excuses. Someone disagrees with us on social media, and we instantly, boom, block them. We start to hide from our close friends so they can't keep us accountable. We ignore their calls, we break their plans, we hide their texts. Defensiveness is a relationship killer. And I think defensiveness comes in three forms. Here they are: blame, excuses, and dismissal. These are three ways we express defensiveness in our relationships. First, when we're defensive, we blame our issues on really anyone or anything else. We're trying to take the spotlight off of us and put it on to others. Blame comes in many forms, but it all boils down to one idea, right? My problems are actually your fault, or my problems are their fault. Defensiveness also comes in the form of making excuses. Instead of just owning our mess, we go to great lengths to absolve ourselves of any character flaws or wrongdoing. We play the victim card and hope that people will buy our story. Lastly, we can be dismissive. When people bring a concern to us, it's easy to just blow them off, right? Say things like, that's not a big deal, or come on, you're just being dramatic, you're overreacting. It's dismissal. These are three ways in which we express defensive behaviors in our relationships: blame, excuses, and dismissal. These are really the hallmarks of defensive behavior. Licensed marriage and family therapist Linda Carroll once wrote, "To be defensive is to react with an overprotective mentality to a situation that perhaps doesn't warrant it." Defensiveness is an impulsive and reactive mode of responding to a situation or conversation. Rather than listening with an open heart, we respond with our metaphorical shields up and weapons drawn. Now, as we discussed last week, in our relationships, we need to create space for healthy conflict and hard conversations. It's how we grow. It's how our relationships move forward. But that can't happen if we're constantly playing defense. Let me tell you a quick story. A few years back, I went to a Seattle Seahawks football game with my buddy Patrick. I got some photos here. Look how awesome we are. Beautiful, gorgeous Northwest day, Lumen Field, downtown Seattle, Washington. Seahawks football is a bit of a religion in the Northwest, so as you can see from this photo, it was packed to the rafters that day. The whole experience was a ton of fun. I admittedly am not the biggest sports fan, but how could you not love an experience like this? Weather was beautiful, the crowd was going wild, but what I quickly learned, as is often the case with Seattle sports, Seahawks played like utter garbage that day. They had this amazing defense out there on the field. We were getting so hyped up as we saw the linebackers sacking the quarterback, making the tackles, stopping the plays. The crowd was going absolutely wild, that whole 12th man vibe. I mean, my ears were bleeding, and I almost spilled my $20 beer on myself. But when it came to offense, these guys could not move the ball down the field. We're talking fumbles. We're talking sacks, misread plays, interceptions. It was killing my buzz out there in the stands. That day, the Seahawks had a vicious defense, but they were making no progress. And that describes our relationships sometimes, doesn't it? All defense, no progress. Because when we're unable to work through difficult conversations because we're being defensive, we get stuck in a holding pattern. Things don't move forward. Resentment starts to build, and our relationships are killed. I didn't mean to rhyme that. That just happened accidentally. Henry Cloud once wrote that defensiveness stifles performance and destroys relationships. So the question is, why do we behave in this way? Why are we so touchy all the time? Why are we constantly defensive with each other? I want us to explore that for a little bit this morning. Psychology has a lot to say about the science behind our defensive behaviors. And this morning I want to share 3 root issues behind our defensiveness. The first one is insecurity. We're defensive because we struggle with insecurity. Insecurity is a feeling of inadequacy or not being good enough. It's uncertainty. It's anxiety about our life, about our goals, our relationships, and anxiety about how other people see us. And insecurity all boils down to fear, right? Fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of others. And that fear causes us to do crazy things. So much of our blaming, excusing, making excuses, and dismissing other people, it comes from our deepest, darkest fears. It's an expression of insecurity. So ask yourself this question this week. What am I most insecure about? Chances are, whatever the answer is, that's what you're going to be the most defensive about. So we're defensive because of our insecurity. We're also defensive because we have blind spots. Much like your windows, your car, when you're changing lanes, we have blind spots in our lives. There are areas of our personalities and behaviors that we are completely oblivious about. When people point out those blind spots, it's actually jarring. It's a bit of a shock. Listen to what Douglas Stone, a professor at Harvard Law School, once said about blind spots. These are things that we can't see about ourselves, but which others do see. When someone tries to give us feedback in a blind spot, we usually reject it as simply wrong. Not because we're being irrationally defensive, but because to us, it actually seems wrong. It leaves us feeling confused because we wonder, what would cause others to give us feedback that is so off target? Are they jealous, petty, naive, or political? As we sort through what would motivate the other person to give us such feedback, we move further and further from considering how the feedback might be useful to us. Our blind spots cause us to be defensive. Let me tell you a story. I remember one night, maybe a few weeks ago, I was relaxing, minding my own business, and eating a delicious bowl of Golden Graham cereal. That's right, I'm a 33-year-old man who enjoys a nice bowl of cereal for dessert every night. And we're talking top shelf stuff, not that like non-name brand, off-brand stuff. We're talking Golden Grahams, Apple Jacks, Cinnamon Toast Crunch, high-class stuff. So anyways, I'm sitting there contemplating the meaning of the universe, being very spiritual, eating Golden Grahams. My wife Kara is in the same room watching The Office for the 500th time. When all of a sudden I'm startled when she loudly exclaims, "Oh my gosh, would you please stop doing that?" I was shocked, and I asked, "Well, doing what?" She said, "You're chewing so loudly and smacking your lips, your mouth is open, you sound like a feral hog at the barnyard slopping it up." I felt personally attacked in that moment, but apparently, unbeknownst to me, I was enjoying my Golden Grams too much and too loudly for my wife. But I wasn't aware of this, right? So her comment caught me off guard, and I immediately became defensive. I started to play the victim card. I used the classic, like, why are you just so mean to me all the time? Which, by the way, it's what our daughter does to us. My wife tries to discipline our 6-year-old daughter, and she says, "Mama, you're being mean to me." She might have got that from watching Dad. This is what blind spots look like in our relationships, right? Somebody points out something that we weren't aware of, and we're shocked, and we're offended, and we react emotionally. We're defensive because of our blind spots. Lastly, I think we're defensive because of past traumas in our lives. Did you know that when we experience traumatic events, they literally rewire the neural pathways in our brains? Neuroscience shows us that trauma actually changes the physiology of your brain. The brain does this because it wants to defend itself from future trauma and pain. The only problem is that your brain doesn't always do the best job of determining real threats from perceived threats. So if you've had a traumatic experience in the past, somebody says something or does something that reminds you of that or triggers you in some way, your brain goes into fight or flight mode. This is what Linda Carroll, the family therapist, wrote. We all carry baggage with us from childhood. Defensiveness is no different. If your parents shamed you often and punished you harshly, it's likely that as an adult, you quickly feel self-protective whenever you see someone upset and angry about something. The reasons for defensiveness are myriad and important to understand, but they don't take away the need to learn how to rewire ourselves away from the impulse to immediately self-protect. So, why are we so defensive? Insecurity, blind spots, and past traumas. And here's the scary thing. Our defensive behavior compounds upon itself. If we're chronically defensive, eventually we'll stop reacting defensively and we'll start being preemptively defensive. We'll start living our lives with a chip on our shoulder, always looking for the next offense, always looking for the next thing to be upset about. And when this happens, we start creating false narratives in our heads that everyone is out to get us. We start reading between the lines of everything everyone says, looking for persecution. It becomes a grand conspiracy that everyone is against us. And that just makes us more defensive. It builds on itself and builds on itself. We build up our walls. We shut off ourselves from relationships and community. And we end up in a very, very dangerous place. Because walls can protect us, yes, but they're also disastrous for our relationships. I've shared this analogy before, but I want to do it again. Do you know that in ancient warfare, a common battle tactic was to surround a city that had protective walls? The invading force would just surround the city, sit outside, and let the people inside starve to death. It was called siege warfare. No invasion was necessary, no attack, nothing. The enemy force would just camp out outside of the walls until the city starved to death on the inside. Maybe it took weeks, maybe it took months, but the walls these people built to protect themselves, ironically, became their own prison. And I think it's the same with our own defensiveness. So this morning we've looked at some of the psychological reasoning behind defensiveness, but now I want to share a story from the life of Jesus. When we read the 4 biographies of Jesus in the New Testament, we're introduced to a ragtag group of young men known as the disciples. The disciples were 12 young, blue-collar men who apprenticed under Jesus as he traveled, taught, and performed miracles. And I love reading about these disciples because I can personally relate to them. They're a hot mess. They're always getting it wrong. They're always misunderstanding Jesus. They're always putting their foot in their mouth. And one thing I've noticed about these disciples is how defensive they would get with Jesus. At one point, we read that Jesus is traveling. He's passing by a Samaritan village. He sends his disciples, James and John, to go greet the people at the village and introduce themselves, but they're immediately rejected. And this shouldn't be a surprise because in that day, Samaritans and Jews hated each other. They were enemies. But this comes as a shock to James and John. And here's what we read. When the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven and destroy them?" Immediately, these two are just off their rocker. They're defensive, they're overreacting, and they think that they have the power or the authority to call down fire from heaven on these people. I mean, rejection doesn't feel good, but really? Fire from heaven? That's what defensiveness looks like. It's always an overreaction. It's always blowing things out of proportion. We read that Jesus turned and rebuked them, and then his disciples went to another village. Jesus told James and John, "Listen, you fellows need to cool your jets." Clearly, these guys, even though they were with Jesus, they didn't understand the way of Jesus. Love and forgiveness and mercy and caring for others. They were so offended that they wanted to use their faith to attack other people. And I think that's something we can still struggle with today. I think when we read the New Testament, Peter, another one of the disciples, is a great example of what defensiveness could look like. He was one of the 12, and we read that he was constantly posturing himself, getting defensive with Jesus and others. There's this moment where Jesus is predicting his own death to his followers. He tells the disciples that soon he will be executed by the religious leaders, but not to worry, soon he would rise from the grave 3 days later. It was a lot for the disciples to wrap their heads around. It was a lot to process. And Peter's not having any of it. Here's how he responds. Peter took him, Jesus, aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Peter doesn't like what he's hearing, so he gets defensive. He starts berating Jesus. His insecurities, his fears, I don't know, maybe even some past traumas, are all boiling to a head when Peter finds out that his beloved friend and teacher is going to die. We read that Jesus scolds Peter for his behavior, but the message apparently doesn't get through because this isn't the last time Peter is defensive. Later, just before Jesus is arrested, he tells his disciples that they will all scatter. He says, "Guys, I'm about to be arrested, and when that happens, you're all going to bail on me. You're all going to run for your lives." And Peter immediately gets defensive. Peter declared, "Even if all fall away, I will not." "Truly, I tell you," Jesus answered, "today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." Peter's adamant. I imagine that he's raising his voice, he's posturing himself, he's puffing out his chest, he's making these ultimatums, but ultimately his fear and anxiety are showing. Fear that would eventually get the best of him. Because we read after Jesus was arrested, as predicted, his followers turned tail and scattered. They ran away. But Peter follows at a distance. He sits outside the temple grounds as Jesus is being interrogated. And then a woman approaches and recognizes Peter as a follower of Jesus. "You were with that Nazarene Jesus," she said, but he denied it. "I don't know or understand what you're talking about," he said, and he went out into the entryway. Denial, defensiveness, fear, just as Jesus predicted. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." And again, he denied it. Peter's starting to build up his walls once again. He's trying to protect himself. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." Peter began to call down curses, and he swore to them, "I don't know this man you're talking about." At this point, Peter is angry. He's indignant. He's swearing. He's cursing. He's overreacting. And he's throwing Jesus under the bus. And immediately we read, the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and began to weep. For all his posturing, for all his big words and defensiveness, reality hits Peter like a freight train. He's afraid, he's alone, and he's turned his back on his best friend. Defensiveness led Peter to a dark place. And it does the same for us as well. But thankfully, that's not the end of the story. After Jesus died, then miraculously rose from the grave 3 days later, we read that he's eventually reunited with his disciples, including Peter. And what happens? He doesn't berate them. He doesn't chastise them. He doesn't say, told you so. He loves them. He embraces them. He forgives them. He teaches them. And he gives them a mission to share God's kingdom all across the earth and throughout history. Peter would go on to be one of the most influential men in all of human history, as he partnered with the disciples in the early church to start a Jesus movement that would change the world forever. Here's the point of this story. Jesus saw Peter at his absolute worst, and yet he still loved him. He still used him to make a massive difference in the world. In Peter's story, not only do we recognize our own defensive tendencies, but we see how Jesus responds to the walls we build. He tears them down, and he invades our lives with love. The walls that we build out of fear, the walls that we build out of insecurity, the walls that we build out of past trauma, Jesus tears them down. As his friend John would later write, perfect love drives out fear. The perfect love of Jesus is the antidote to our defensive behavior. Defensiveness is a relationship killer, but love is the answer. In fact, love is the polar opposite of defensiveness. Listen to how love is described by Paul, one of the earlier leaders in the Christian church. He wrote that love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not honor or dishonor others. It's not self-seeking, it's not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres, and it never yells at its husband for eating golden grams. Excuse me. This is the kind of love that Jesus showed to his disciples. It's the type of love that he extends towards us and invites us to express in our own relationships. It's the type of love that tears down walls, builds each other up, builds bridges, and creates healthy relationships. This morning, we've examined the psychology behind our defensive behavior. We've looked at the life of Peter to see how Jesus responds to our defensiveness with love. And now I want to wrap up our last few minutes by just giving you 3 quick tips on how to be less defensive in your relationships. I think if we want to eliminate defensiveness in our relationships, we need to express love in 3 different ways. That is self-awareness, authenticity, and trust. Remember earlier when we discussed the different forms of defensiveness? These tactics help us counter them in a loving way. Instead of blame, it's self-awareness. We're aware of our emotions. We're aware of our brokenness and hang-ups. We're aware of our past traumas, right? Then instead of excuses, it's authenticity. We bring our whole self to our relationships. We don't have to pretend that we're perfect. We acknowledge our humanity with each other. No pretending. And lastly, instead of dismissal, it's trust. And I think trust really is the key. Think back to Peter earlier. Why was he so defensive with Jesus all the time? For whatever reason, he could not bring himself to fully trust Jesus. But trust and love are absolutely inseparable. There are no relationships without love, and there's no love without trust. In fact, that's what this faith thing is all about. It's trust. It's trust that Jesus is who he says he is. It's trust that Jesus' ways are the ways. It's trust that Jesus genuinely wants the best for us. Peter may have been defensive at first, as we get to see in his story. But if you continue to read about the life of Peter throughout the New Testament, and I would certainly encourage you to do so, you see a man who came to such a radical place of trust in Jesus that he was willing to give his entire life to following in his footsteps. Peter loved Jesus, and he expressed that love through radical trust. I wonder what would happen if we brought that same level of trust to our own relationships. What if we assumed our loved ones want the best for us? What if we moved from a posture of suspicious defensiveness to a posture of openness, of love and trust? It's hard, yeah. It's scary, yeah. You're probably going to have your trust broken a few times, yeah. But trust is necessary for us to have healthy relationships. As the American author Edith Hamilton once said, love cannot live where there is no trust. Neighborhood relationships are so important. Too important, in fact, to kill with our defensive attitudes. Now remember, in this series, we want to remind you of something. You're responsible for changing yourself, not for changing others. We don't want you to use the conversations in this series as ammo to lob against your loved ones. We don't want you running out of the room saying, well, see, told you, Jordan said it, Forrest said it, you're defensive, you're critical, you're a jerk. Please don't do that. Instead, let's work on being better so our relationships can get better and then our community and world can be transformed. Let's follow Jesus in everything and let love be the guiding principle in our relationships. Let me pray for us today. Lord, thank you so much for this time together. Thank you for the wonderful relationships in our lives. Would you help us to have healthier relationships? Would you help us to be more authentic, more self-aware, more open, more willing to engage in difficult conversations that move our relationships forward? I ask that you be with everyone today as they go out of this place. Be present in their relationships. Be present in their lives and use them in awesome ways to share your light and love with our world. Jesus, we love you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Oh, hey, buddy.
Is it me, or is it every time Jordan talks, I feel personally attacked? That's
intentional.
Yeah, that's a figure. That's passive aggressiveness. Maybe we should talk about that as a relationship killer.
Passive aggressiveness and sarcasm are a love language, not a relationship killer.
Fair enough. This is what every day at our office is like. So, hey, a couple of quick things before you get out of here. Don't forget, if you're here checking us out, go to the next lounge, grab a free gift. Love to say hi to you. Sign up for that Care Portal thing. Sign up for the Parent Summit in Tim Elmore. It is a great investment of your dollars and your time. And don't forget, we're not sort of doing the pass the basket thing anymore. So if you give sort of in person and not online to the mission, don't forget we've got the boxes at the back. Hey, love y'all. Have a great week. We'll see you later.